congratulations on the Appalachian Trail Festival. Bully for you! My name is Theodore Roosevelt. I was your 26th president, and I had a bully time in the White House. I enjoyed myself greatly there. I am so happy to be back in Millinocket, back in the North Woods of Maine, and indeed back at Katahdin. You may not know that I came here frequently in 1878 and 1879 as a young man. And I did reach the summit of Katahdin when I was 20 years old, just before my 21st birthday. And those of you who know the great joys of hiking the Appalachian Trail, of living the vigorous life, will know that indeed we should perhaps have as a rite of passage making the summit of that mountain at the age of 21 rather than making it to the corner tavern. I am back to celebrate with you the great outdoors, a dedication to conservation, to the life of hunting and canoeing and hiking. But the greatest legacy in domestic policy was the 250 million acres of national forests, parks, and wildlife refuges and national monuments that we created and put under public protection. And it's an honor and a pleasure to be in Katahdin, where the people of this region believe in sustaining that principle of conservation, but also the use of the wonderful lands that we have for recreation and for exploration and indeed for resource management. For those of you who are in the lumber industry, God bless and keep you as you continue to sustain that great industry which means so much in the great northern woods.
A word about the Teddy Roosevelt climb, because there are a number of traditions in this area about the Roosevelt climb. Some are not quite accurate. Most are indeed accurate. In 1878, Teddy Roosevelt was a junior at Harvard College. A rather sickly boy. He had been a real burden to the family, had a very severe asthmatic condition, had a lot of stomach problems, had serious headaches, and there was some concern even not only about his health, but whether he would live very long. And the year before, in 1877, he lost his father. His father died. And he was kind of footloose, but his family and a couple of cousins were very concerned, and they felt that the thing to do was to have Teddy go up to Maine and come under a guide and get strengthened up a little bit. And so in 1878, his cousin, who had come the year before, made arrangements with a guide by the name of Bill Sewell in Island Falls. And Roosevelt and his group came up to Mattawamkeag, and they rented a carriage, and they came to Island Falls, and Bill Sewell comes to greet them, and here is this thin young man who Bill Sewell realized right away needed some strengthening and some fixing up. But there was also something about this young man, and there was something about the relationship of the two of them that was very, very special, and it happened very quickly. Sewell took Roosevelt and his group on a very rigorous trip that summer. It lasted for something like 2 or 3 weeks or more. And Roosevelt loved every minute of it. He had a struggle at first, but he was determined. He had grit, as you well know, and it all came out in this Maine experience. When he left to go back to college, he vowed that he would come back. And so he did in in 1879. First of all, in March, when Bill Sewell took him on a winter trip during the spring break at college, and that strengthened him up even more, and he loved that. Then he came back in the summer, in the fall, early fall, and, late August, I guess it was. And Bill Sewell thought, well, it's time for this young man to climb Katahdin. So he and Bill Sewell's cousin, Will Dow, guided him up to Katahdin. We know only, there isn't much in the account, in the journal, in Roosevelt's journal, but we know that he came to Hunt Farm, crossed the East Branch. They camped at the head of Katahdin Lake. There was no no sporting camps at that time. And then went on to Chimney Pond. And along the way, the legend is that he lost one of his boots and had to complete the climb in moccasins. Now, when I first read that, I thought, you know, that sounds like one of those legends that has the stuff of uncertain truth about that great figures in American history sometimes pick up. So I decided to try, at least as far as I could do it, to find out the truth. And I finally got a hold of Roosevelt's journal from Yale University. And sure enough, there it is. In a stream, in a riffle, as he put it, I lost one of my boots and had to finish the climb in my moccasins. We know that some of the other members of the party did not make it to the top, but Roosevelt and Bill Sewell and Will Dow indeed did. They came back in a terrible rainstorm, and that didn't bother Roosevelt at all. After that trip, he still had some time before school, and so Roosevelt talked Sewell into taking him on another wilderness trip, canoeing and hiking and camping for another 10 days. When he left, he never came back to the North Woods again. He came to Maine on several campaign visits, but he never came back up into this area again. But a relationship had developed, and a correspondence began between Bill Sewell and Teddy Roosevelt that was to last for the rest of their lives. And Bill Sewell has actually written a little book about his experiences with Roosevelt, and Roosevelt has written on several occasions about his experiences with Sewell. They shared deeply. It was he became a father figure for Roosevelt. And they corresponded about American values. Sewell was very well read in the classics, even though he had no education. And he had very strong moral principles and ethics, so that that became a bond. When Roosevelt bought his ranch out in the Dakotas, not too many years after college, he asked Bill Sewell and Will Dow to come and manage it for him. And indeed, the Sewell and the Dow families went out and managed the ranch. And it was during that time that Roosevelt was faced with a choice. He had been under some pressure from the political folk in New York to come back and stand for election as mayor of New York. It was a political family, of course. And he was very uncertain. He loved the wilderness, he loved the West. So he was struggling with this, and there's a wonderful account in Bill Sewell's book about how they went off together, and Roosevelt posed this question: what do you think I should do? And Sewell, without any hesitation, said, you certainly have got to go back. Your ethics, your moral stance, your leadership ability, and so on and so forth, are needed. And he said, I don't have any question that you will one day be president. And Teddy laughed at that heartily. But in a few weeks, he was on his way to New York for the nomination and for the mayor of New York, and the rest is, of course, history. I have no doubt that Roosevelt's commitment to the American conservation movement, which was such a part of his presidency, was because he climbed Katahdin. After all, that's what it can do to someone. But it's the Roosevelt-Sewell story is really great.
Indeed, I was your president, Theodore Roosevelt. I served from 1901 till 1909. And for those of you who appreciate American history, today is September 14th. Today is the day when, under an emergency basis, I took the oath of office in Buffalo, New York. On that sad occasion, when having been shot 8 days earlier at the Pan American Expo in Buffalo, President McKinley lingered and died. And I had my race down from Mount Marcy. Just as Katahdin is the highest point in Maine, I had been climbing and had ascended the day before Mount Marcy, the highest point in the Adirondacks, the highest point in New York. I must admit, climbing mountains is in my veins. And I must admit I'm a bit humbled then that my visage appears now on Mount Rushmore, one of our other great mountains in the West. Well, bully for you, and may we have a round of applause for Millinocket, Maine, and the Appalachian Trail Festival. What a delight to be a part of this great festival, and indeed you may know that in a way it is a homecoming for me, because it was 130 years ago this very month when I first came to the great North Woods of Maine. I did so via Island Falls, where a man named William Sewell took me under his care. That very year, in that February, my father had died. It was a dark day for me. There's a large black X in my diary. I said the light had gone out of my life. I'd lost my best friend. But my tutor, Arthur Cutler, felt it would be good for my health and my spirits if I came up to the North Woods of Maine and spent some time with a hunting guide named William Sewell that he had hunted and canoed and fished with. And I must admit it was wonderful to be with the Sewell family and to hunt and canoe and fish and hike with William Sewell and the great lumbermen of the North, but in great part because of the hospitality, the kindness, the virtue, and the habit that the Sewell family had, which is so typical of the people of Maine, to make me welcome as a part of their household. Thank you for your hospitality then, and thank you for your hospitality today. I am back to applaud you for your embrace of doing the right thing and standing for the square deal, for living the conservation legacy, and indeed for living the vigorous life. So many of you look fit and trim. You ride your bicycles about town. You hike. Nearly every other car has a canoe rack atop it. And good for you men and women who have a gun rack on the back of your pickup truck as well. Bully for you. I was holding hearings in New York and in Albany and traveling back and forth. And I was a happy young man because my wife, Alice, was expecting our first child. I indeed was known as the man with the sunshine in his face. And happy was the day when I got a telegram stating that Alice had delivered a healthy baby girl. Why, congratulations were had all about, even from the man with whom I'd had the fisticuffs. But that same afternoon, a dark and foreboding telegram was received that sent me to the train and on the train down the Hudson Valley and to the family brownstone in New York. Where, when I arrived in the middle of the night and ascended the steps, my brother answered the door with these words. He said, "Mother is dying and your wife is too." On February 14th, 1884, when I was but 25 years old, my mother died in the morning of typhoid fever. That afternoon, my young bride, but 22 years old herself, died of Bright's disease, a kidney disease now quite treatable by your modern medicine. It was a dark day. I was terribly sad. A friend wrote of the twin funeral 2 days later. Theodore knows neither what he does nor says. But I remembered the words of my late father. Dark care seldom sits behind the rider whose pace is swift enough. Get action. And I set about to get action. First, I had my daughter Alice, named for her late mother, taken care of by my older sister Bammy. Off to Chicago I went to the Republican Convention, fighting for a reform ticket, and from there out to my ranch in the Dakotas, purchased the previous year. Now, I mentioned that Hannah called me a lunatic cowboy. It was my time in the Dakotas that gave me that moniker. Can you imagine if they thought me a strange dude in Albany, New York? Can you imagine how the cowboys of the Great West in 1884 thought me when I got off that Union Pacific train in Medora, Dakota Territory? Why, I had spurs, a belt buckle, and handguns all pearled and silvered by Tiffany's. I had a cowboy shirt that cost me $100. That would be $1,000 today. And I had spectacles, they being some sign of a defect in a man's moral character. Now, I did my best to earn the respect of my fellow Westerners by working in the saddle and by hunting with rifle and working alongside them just as long. We had a great bully time in the Dakota Territory, and what you may not know is that my great Elkhorn Ranch on the Little Missouri River was built of cottonwood trees that were chopped down, and that structure was built with the aid of my two great friends from Island Falls, Maine, William Sewell and Wilmot Dow. Famous is the story that we were out chopping down the cottonwoods one day, and those two great lumbermen, mighty with axe, chopped down much more than I could. We came back to the ranch, and one of the cowboys asked the lumbermen how we'd done. Not knowing that I was within earshot, Wilmot Dow said, well, Bill cut down 59 trees, I cut down 53, and the boss, he beavered down 19. Any of you who've seen the good work of a beaver down by the river will know what they meant. But those men were tremendous for me. I made them the foreman of my Dakota ranch. Can you imagine two men who've grown up their whole lives in the north woods of Maine, doing the work with axe, working on the river, hunting and fishing, hunting guides that indeed guided me up my first ascent, my ascent of Katahdin? Can you imagine those men as foremen on a cattle ranch? Well, they did a wonderful job. They did so well that in the second year, both returned and brought their wives back out to the Dakota Territory. Now, we had great adventures in the Dakota Territory, and out there Sewell and Dow each had the first of their children. It was during that time that Mrs. Sewell and Mrs. Dow began to provide things for the table like vegetables and jellies, for before we had a great deal of beef. Now, what we didn't have was milk. Thousands of cattle and not a drop of milk. We decided to have an experiment. Once we had killed some of the predators, we attempted to domesticate some of the cows. But you know, when you chase a cow for 2 miles, throw it and rope it and toss it upside down, while it's very exciting and thrilling, it doesn't produce very much in the way of milk. It was in the Dakota Territory that I had one of my greatest adventures, of which I spoke throughout my life, and Mr. Sewell and Mr. Dow play a key role in it. I awoke one morning to find that my scow had been stolen from the Little Missouri. Its rope had been cut, and a mitten lay next to the cut rope. Now, my scow was the only boat on the Little Missouri. The Little Missouri only being a river where you might need a boat 1 or 2 months out of the year. The other times it being a very, very narrow and very, very skinny little stream. But now it was a very handy thing to have to get supplies across the river when the river was in freshet. But this was the winter time, and I had planned to use the scow to get across the river on a cougar hunt that I was to have that day. And when I awoke to find that boat stolen, I was very mad. I was determined to get on my horse and chase after the men who obviously taken the scow downstream. But William Sewell prevailed on me. He said, "There's no way that you'll catch the men on horse because so much of the river's edge is frozen, you'll never get a clear shot." So instead, Sewell and Dow sent to town for nails, and we built a second scow. We knew that the thieves were very likely Red Finnegan and his gang, who had a cabin above us. And that indeed, vigilantes were interested in pursuing and stringing those men up for horse thievery, of which they were suspected. But now, when we built the second boat, we waited for a winter storm to pass. 1 week behind the other men who stole the boat, we set off down the river. And those great Maine rivermen, who knew so well how to guide a boat by pole, within 2 days, we'd caught up to the men who'd stolen the scow. They were confident of not being pursued. And when we came upon their campground, 2 of the men were gone. We surprised the 3rd man left at the camp. And when the other 2 men came back to the camp, Sewell and Dow helped me to arrest the men. Because I was chairman of the local Stockmen's Association, I was ex officio a deputy marshal. I arrested the men. We collected a variety of weapons from them. But soon we realized that our circumstance was difficult. The weather was so cold that we could not bind their hands, for they would have gotten frostbite from the binding. I instructed Sewell and Dow to take both boats downstream, a couple 100 miles. And meanwhile, I proceeded to walk the offending 3 prisoners over 100 miles of Dakota territory, and I did arrive then at Mandan. And I walked the men into the local jail, and I collected my $50 bounty for expenses in the mileage covered as a deputy sheriff. But what a great adventure we had, Sewell and Dow and I in the Dakota territory. I would have never been president, but for my time in the Dakotas. And Mr. Sewell, whether it was here in Maine after my father died, or in the Dakotas when I was thinking about what to do with my life, William Sewell was the father figure in my life. And that great Maine dedication to common sense and virtuous living and the life of public service, those are the things that were reaffirmed in me by that great North woodsman, William Sewell from Island Falls, Maine. In his memory, a round of applause. Now, in the White House, I said I believed in the power of the executive. I was a progressive. And you know that the opposite of progress often is Congress. I fought for a progressive agenda on conservation, for the creation of the United States Forest Service, for the naming of all sorts of national forests around the country, for national parks, for wildlife refuges, and indeed for the National Monuments and Antiquities Act. But Congress was upset with all of this conservation. They passed a law stating that the president shall have no more authority by executive order to name national forests in the great forested northwestern states. But that amendment was a portion of a larger agricultural bill which I had to sign. I could not veto the bill. But I set about with Gifford Pinchot. We burned the midnight oil. For weeks, we studied the forests and the maps of the great Northwest. And the day before I had to sign that greater bill, I signed into existence 19 million more acres of national forest, and they are still known today as the Great Midnight Forests, a legacy for the American people. They fought me on national parks, Congress did. They said that they would not make a national park of the Great Grand Canyon because developers were working hand in pocket with Congress. Can you imagine the Great Grand Canyon, that great work of God's finger, being set asunder by having hotels all along its rim? I could not. So I went around Congress. I named the basin of the Grand Canyon a National Wildlife Refuge. I named the sides of the Grand Canyon a National Monument. And I said Congress would eventually come about their senses, and a decade later they did. But in the meanwhile, Congress flipped handsprings in their wrath. Speaker Joe Cannon said that President Roosevelt has no more use for the Constitution than a tomcat has for a marriage license. I said the Constitution is made for the people, and not the people for the Constitution. And when I look back on my domestic legacy, 8 years in office as your president, a decade more in the advocation of good public policy, the best thing that I've left for the American people is something that I ask you to dedicate yourselves to leaving to the generations not yet born. The great public lands, over 230 million acres, of forests, parks, and national treasures put in the public care. And I hope that you maintain those and pass those on to future generations. And at the Sorbonne, I made the speech for which I am perhaps most famous. It has a bit of advice that I shared then about being a citizen in a republic, and as I get to the conclusion of my remarks, I share a bit of it with you today. Because remember, just as I rebounded from tragedy in my life, just as you are called to respond to the circumstances about you in this region of Maine and in your community, when you do your good works, you will be criticized. But remember, it is not the critic who counts. Not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done better. The credit belongs to the man and today to the woman who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs and comes up short again and again, because there is no effort without error or shortcoming, but who knows the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, and who, in the end, at the best, knows the triumph of high achievement, and who, at the worst, if he fails, at least he fails while daring greatly, that his name shall never be with those cold and timid souls who know neither victory nor defeat. I leave you with one story that's a bit more upbeat and fun than a story of the battles and the sacrifice. It's a hunting story. I loved to hunt in Maine, and I loved to hunt while I was the president. I founded Boone and Crockett in my living room in 1886, the nation's oldest conservation and hunting organization. But I'm perhaps most famous for a hunt in 1903 in Mississippi, a hunt where I didn't get the quarry. We were out hunting bear, and we didn't see any bear. After days, the famous hunting guide Holt Collier, a man of mixed race, he said that he would have next day a bear if he had to bring one into the camp on the end of a rope. Well, the next morning, indeed, the camp was alight with commotion. The dogs were barking, men were shouting, and indeed, when we went out of the camp, we found that Holt Collier had tied a wounded bear to a tree. The bear had been wounded by the hunting hounds, two of which it killed. Holt Collier had clubbed the bear on the head, a great gash and blood proceeding from the bear's head. And some in my hunting party actually encouraged me, saying, "Mr. President, go ahead, there's your bear. Go ahead and shoot your bear." Can you imagine such a cowardly deed? A cornerstone of Boone and Crockett is fair hunting. So indeed, I refused to shoot the bear, and the cartoonist Clifford Berryman drew a cartoon of that refusal, calling it "Drawing the Line in Mississippi." That cartoon was posted in the Washington Post, and then throughout the nation. I soon received a telegram from New York, from the Mitchum family, toy manufacturers, and they said they would like to make a stuffed bear and name it after me. I wrote back saying, "I don't see what good it will do your sales, but you may go ahead and do so." And I wonder if any of you might know that legacy and might indeed have the comfort of a teddy bear at your home. I hope so. It has been a pleasure and a delight to be with you today. I carry Maine with me everywhere I go. And this year, in celebration of my 150th birthday, my family has gone to nearly every state in the Union, but a handful of states here in New England to go. And there is none that ranks above Maine for having made a difference in my life. From the hike up the summit of Katahdin to being at a place called Bible Point, now a portion of Baxter State Park where Lake Mattawamkeag and First Brook come together, where as a young man I was known to do my morning Bible devotion. I do hope that when you think of the wonderful legacy you have here in Baxter State Park, that you'll remember that in 1918 at the Republican Convention in Portland, Maine, I had a chance to visit with then State Senator Percival Baxter, and we talked about our vision for conservation. And I hope you will keep alive, as I do, the great connection between that conservation legacy, the people of Maine,
in the great state of Maine.